Hello and welcome to the 2024 e-sgol learning sessions. Today is the first session of the AS psychology sessions. We're going to do 4 sessions all together. Today is the first one. On the screen in front of you, you can see the 4 different areas that these sessions will cover. Starting off with the assumptions of the approach, and I'm also going to go through some different exam techniques. Then we're going to look at evaluation questions, again with exam techniques. Then we are looking at relationship formation questions, and again, exam technique. And then lastly, we are going to do an overall summary of everything that I have covered in the 3 previous sessions. Okay, so today we are looking at assumptions. The assumptions of the approach are a really important place to start when looking at the approaches in psychology. It may be the first thing that your psychology teacher will teach you about, because it is the main sort of ideas and theories that psychologists within that approach think about human behaviour. So, like I said, for each approach, you will look at about 3 assumptions. And an assumption is an initial idea or a theory that the approach believes about behaviour, about humans. Where does their behaviour come from? And depending on which approach you're looking at, all of the assumptions will be different. So I'm going to look at the biological approach today, but obviously you will also have 3 assumptions for the rest of the approaches as well. Your centre will teach you 3 different approaches and provide examples. Now, every teacher is different and every school and centre is different. So the examples that I give you and the detail that I give you around these examples may be slightly different to what you learn, but I am sticking to the specification of the AS psychology exam board. So lots of this you will be familiar with. Then I've got a little box at the bottom of the screen, as you can see, that says top tips. So assumption questions are usually range between 4 to 8 marks. Sometimes you're asked about 1 assumption, sometimes you're asked about 2. And you can be asked to describe a specific assumption, or you will be asked to pick 1 or 2 from an approach. Now, this is where sometimes they can trick you a little bit, I guess, in that they can say, you know, describe 2 assumptions of the biological approach, or they can say describe the evolutionary influences and 1 other assumption of the biological approach. And that way you do need to make sure that you are learning all 3, because you don't know which one's going to prop up. So just be aware of that when you're doing your revision. Having examples is very important for gaining marks, and I will go through when I look at the exam technique on the importance of making sure you have examples in your answer. And then, as always in psychology, the use of appropriate terminology will really help you move up that mark band. But again, we will have a look at that as we go on. Okay, so like I said, sticking with the biological approach, there are 3 different assumptions of this approach. We've got evolutionary influences, localization of brain function, and neurotransmitters. And what I'm going to do for you today is go through each one, and then we're going to have a look at, right, how would we actually answer and put the information that we're learning into the exam. That's the plan. So we're going to start with evolutionary influences. So here we go. So evolution, you will probably know from GCSE science. It's something that you have covered already, and you probably, have looked at it in religious studies and just primary school probably. So it's something that you probably are quite familiar with. So evolution refers to how species changes and adapts to its environment over time. It's how we have evolved, it's how we have changed and learned from our environment about how to behave. And the theory has been applied to the development of the mind over millions of years to cope with the demands of our environment today. So not only is it to do with physically how somebody looks, they've also applied it in psychology to the way that somebody's mind works as well. Okay, so you've got evolution, and then the next thing you've got is natural selection, which is also part of Charles Darwin's theory. And this is basically saying that stronger behaviours enable people to survive. If you've got a strong behaviour or a strong gene, you will survive, you will live longer. And when you reproduce, when you have children, you will pass that gene on to the next generation. So it says here, behaviour that enhances a person's survival will be naturally selected. And then those people will reproduce and pass on the beneficial genes to the next generation. So this is a little example that isn't necessarily on the specification, but it is something that you could discuss in an answer if you wanted to. The question is, which giraffe would be more likely to survive and pass its genes on? And you can see you've got 5 giraffes there, starting from one with not a very long neck all the way up to one that has the longest neck. And the answer here is that, you know, the giraffe with the long neck is going to be able to reach more leaves on the trees, and therefore it's going to have more food, which means it's going to be healthier, it's going to survive for longer, it's going to pass on those long neck genes onto its offspring, and therefore that trait has been naturally selected, okay, because it's made sure that they were able to survive. So snakes and spiders are poisonous and can kill with one bite. People who are predisposed to avoid these animals are less likely to get bitten and die. They will therefore survive longer and be more likely to reproduce, passing these genes onto their offspring. So that's how we have learned, and that's where phobias have come from, in that somebody at one point in their life was bitten by a snake and was very, very poorly, and learned from that not to do that again, passed on that beneficial learning experience onto their offspring, which has led to why people are living longer. And it's just a little link to phobias, which you will look at in the behaviourist approach as well. Okay, so those two definitions, you've got evolution and natural selection, they are your description part of your answer. The next bit I'm going to go on to looks at the example, which is the most important part, really, because this is where you're really going to use your psychology and you're going to gain those marks. So an example for evolution is something called EEA, which stands for Environment of Evolutionary Adaptiveness. Now, the environment to which a species is adapted to at the time and the selective pressures in that environment. Okay, so for a little bit more context, savannas in Africa, humans that had larger brains just naturally had better social skills, were able to form good relationships with other people. They were most likely to cope with the complex social organisation of the species because they were more confident and they were able to make more friends. They survived and they passed on these genes, so the genes of good social skill, onto the next generation. And that's where people being sociable may have come from. Okay, so environment of evolutionary adaptiveness would be your example for evolution. And then your example for natural selection is something called altruism. Now, altruism is a psychological term, but it's something that is quite commonly known. People, you know, use the word quite a lot. You may have heard it already. And altruistic behaviour is essentially a selfless good deed. So this could link to where parents risk their lives to save their offspring, is said to be an inherited trait to increase the chances of survival of their genes. They want their children to live long and be happy and be healthy, and therefore they are willing to risk their lives so that their children can go and pass on the beneficial genes. Okay, so that's altruistic behaviour. Okay, so this is an example answer that could come up in the exam. And it says, using examples from psychology, describe the evolutionary influences assumption from the biological approach. Now, you will get an assumptions question in the exam. It's always there, okay? We just don't know which approach it's going to ask you about. Now, we are aiming for the full marks here. So description and level of accuracy is thorough and clearly linked to psychology, and we have effective use of appropriate terminology. So here you would do your description of evolution and natural selection. You would define what they are, and then you would provide an example. Now, your example can be altruistic behaviour and EEA, okay, environment of evolutionary adaptiveness. You've got to get in your minds that it's description, example, okay, and within the example it's using the appropriate terminology, okay. It's things like altruistic behavior, natural selection, genes. They're all psychological terminology that will make sure that you get that top mark band. Okay, let's have a look at another assumption. So the second assumption of the biological approach is localization of brain function. Now, this started with the man that you can see on the screen, and this is Phineas Gage. Now, Phineas Gage was a really, really famous case study that sparked lots and lots of psychological research. And what happened to Phineas Gage is actually quite sad, but also super interesting. He was a really nice guy. He was known as a family man, very pleasant, very polite, and he worked on his job was to create the space for railway tracks to be built through mountains. So what he did was he would put dynamite into the ground. He would use a big metal rod, the one that he's holding in the picture, to push it into the ground. He would run away, he would let the dynamite explode, he would clear it all out, and he would go again, okay, just to make sure that there was a path through the tunnel so that a train could go through it, basically. Now, one day he didn't move back fast enough, and the pole went through his eye socket here, and it came out the top of his head here, which is known as our frontal lobe. Now, from this, he actually survived the incident, but lots of people noticed there was some things that were a bit different about him. His personality changed, and they said that he wasn't a very nice man. And there's lots of stories to say that he had murderous tendencies as well. So it kind of made people realise, oh, hang on a minute then, if you have damage or lose a part of the front of your brain, your personality changes. So does that mean that your personality is at the front of your head? Okay. Because before that, they didn't really know very much about the brain. This was a long time ago. They didn't have the machinery to look so closely into somebody's brain. So it was really difficult to understand the brain. And it wasn't until obviously something bad had to happen for them to realise, hang on a minute here, maybe different parts of the brain have different functions. Okay, and that is essentially what localization of brain function means. So there is a little diagram here on the screen, and there are 4 lobes of the brain, and the 4 lobes of the brain are color-coded on the screen. So the first one is the frontal lobe here, right at the front of your head, and that is in yellow. You have got the pink part of the brain, which is here. You have them on either side, and that is your parietal lobe. You have got the green one, which is right by your temples here, which is your temporal lobe at the side. And then you have the blue one on the screen, which is right at the back of your head, and that is called your occipital lobe. Now, your occipital lobe at the back of your head controls your eyesight, okay? Controls visual information. So that is its brain function, okay? So eyesight is localized here. And that's where the term eyes at the back of your head comes from. So this is what the four lobes do, okay? Frontal lobe is thinking, creativity, and personality. So we know about personality because of Phineas Gage. Temporal lobe is to do with sensory information, so temperature, touch, and pain. Parietal lobe. Temporal lobe at the side is to do with memory, but also because it's close to your ear, auditory information in case of hearing. And then, like I said before, occipital lobe at the back is visual information. You also have two hemispheres in your brain. You have got your left and your right hemisphere. Your left hemisphere is for language. Okay, so it's quite nice to remember it as L, left language. And your right hemisphere is for creativity. Okay, so that is your description. Okay, when we're looking at description, as I was talking about it with evolution and natural selection, the lobes of the brain are your description for this assumption. And you need to have some examples. So you have got two areas of the brain that have specific functions, and they are the Broca's area and the vernix area. Okay, so Broca's area was founded by a researcher who was looking after a man, and the man could only say the word tan. He understood language, he understood what people were saying to him, but he couldn't respond. He couldn't form a logical sentence. So his response was always tan, 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 tan. And because at the time, so obviously it was 1861, at the time there was no MRI scans, there was no way that we could look at the brain. So you have to wait until he passed away and do an autopsy of the brain. Now, the brain showed damage to the left lower part of the frontal lobe. Now, left, remember, is language. And obviously, only producing the word tan is to do with language. And it was the lower part of his frontal lobe. Now, Broca's concluded that this part of the brain is responsible for language, as problems in this area led to what we call an aphasia. Now, an aphasia is problems producing or understanding language. So that part of the brain, because it was founded by Broca, is now called the Broca's area. And the person that could only say the word tan had something called Broca's aphasia. Okay, so could understand language, but could not produce language in response. Okay, second example is vernix. Okay, again, we're looking at something called vernix aphasia. So 1874, a man called Vernix reported a number of patients who suffered different types of aphasia. They could speak, but what they were saying had no relevance to what they were talking about. So it's basically talking nonsense, really. So being able to produce lots of sentences and speak quite openly, however, what they're saying makes no sense at all. There's some really good videos on YouTube of people that have got Broca's and vernix aphasia, and they document their therapy process. And it's really, really interesting to see how they started and where they are now. So I would recommend having a look on YouTube for some videos and some examples of actually seeing somebody that has got the condition. Autopsy showed damage to the top of the temporal lobe, again on the left side. Oh, sorry, right. Okay. Question then, so have a little look. So using examples from psychology, describe localization of brain function assumption from the biological approach. Again, we're looking for this 4 marks, aren't we? We want top mark band. So description and level of accuracy is thorough and clearly linked to psychology. And we want effective use of terminology throughout. So what are we going to put? I have got a little tiny plan. So you're going to start off by asking yourself, and this doesn't just mean for the biological approach or for the localization of brain function assumption, just for any assumption that you come across, what is the assumption? What actually are they saying? Okay, so in this case, they are saying that behavior in our brain is caused by localization of brain function. But what does that actually mean? You've got to tell the examiner, yes, I know it's localization of brain function, but I also know what localization of brain function means. So you can say that different parts of the brain are responsible, or they guide, or let's go with responsible. I feel like that's the best word. They are responsible for different behaviors. Okay, they have their different areas that they look into. Give your details. Okay, so for example, the frontal lobe, temporal lobe, parietal lobe, and occipital lobe. Okay, the frontal lobe is to do with personality. This was founded by Phineas Gage, who had damage to the lobe, and his personality changed. Temporal lobe is to do with hearing. Parietal lobe is to do with senses, touch, things like that, temperature. Occipital lobe, it looks at visual information. You can list those. You can say there are 4 lobes of the brain, frontal, temporal, parietal, occipital, and you can give some detail into what they do. Okay. Before moving on to it, like I said before, your really important bit, which is linking it to an example. So the example here, you have got Broca's area or Wernicke's area. Doesn't really matter which one you use, it's up to you, but putting one of them in, one of the 2 in as an example, will boost your marks right up that mark band. Okay, so you could say there is an area called Broca's area, and this is situated, left frontal lobe. It is it was found from an autopsy of a man who could only say the word tan. They found that damage to this area meant that somebody could understand information but had trouble producing sentences. That would give you a really, really nice detailed example of what you're talking about, which is localization of brain function. Okay, moving on to the last assumption of the biological approach, which is neurotransmitters. Now, neurotransmitters is something that pops up quite a lot in psychology, whether you are studying it at AS or A2. And it is basically, it can be quite tricky and it can be quite daunting for students to actually look at this and understand it. But the best way to remember it is that it is just your brain's way of communicating with you, okay? And neurotransmitters are just chemical messages that move around your brain and communicate to each other, but also to you. Well, like I've just communicated, I'm quite tired, and that's why I've yawned. But they communicate to you your feelings, your emotions, and how you should deal with situations, whether you feel angry, whether you feel guilty, and whether you feel happy, sad, things like that. And you need to know the process of synaptic transmission, okay, which I like to teach it in a 4-stage process. So an action potential travels down your presynaptic neuron. Now I have got a diagram which I'm going to show you, which hopefully will put this into a little bit more context. It triggers the release of neurotransmitters of small sacs called vesicles. Now when I talk about terminology as something that definitely needs to be in your answers, this one is massive on terminology. The neurotransmitters diffuse across the synaptic gap or the synaptic cleft, and they bind to the receptor sites of the postsynaptic neuron. Now, those 4 sentences are the key points from the whole process of synaptic transmission. Now, having a look at it, so this is your process of synaptic transmission happening here. So coming down here, down the yellow neuron, this is your presynaptic neuron, this is your postsynaptic neuron. Presynaptic neuron here, the yellow one, these circles that you have with the black dots inside, the black dots are your neurotransmitters, and the circles are vesicles. Okay, so vesicles are just what keep the neurotransmitters in. And basically what happens is neurotransmitters are released and they diffuse across this area in the middle, which is called your synaptic gap, or you can call it synaptic cleft. And then they bind to the receptor site, so that thing that receives them, on the postsynaptic neurons, these pink bits at the end. Think of them as doors with labels on, and the door says dopamine this way, serotonin this way, and all the dopamine and serotonin that are in the sacs are going through these doors. Okay, so they can find where they need to be in the brain so that you process and function normally. So, main example, I did mention it just then, is serotonin. Now, serotonin is a neurotransmitter that affects our mood. Okay, it's to do with happiness, it's to do with sadness as well. Now, people that have a diagnosis of depression don't have enough serotonin. Now, that can be from naturally, they just don't really produce it very much, and they might just need a little bit of help. Or the serotonin in their brain could decrease following a traumatic event. Now, what we need to do is, if they don't have enough serotonin, is we need to give them more serotonin. So antidepressant medications has a little bit of serotonin in them, so that there is more serotonin at the postsynaptic receptor site. So if I go back, they will make sure there's more serotonin in your brain, so more serotonin can attach itself to those pink receptor sites and go down and flow through the brain, just adding a little bit more of what you are lacking. Serotonin and the next example, dopamine, are really good examples to learn and to know about, because they are parts of the specification of psychology that pop up a lot, and especially in year 13 as well. So you've got serotonin, which is your first one. And then your second example is dopamine. So high levels of the neurotransmitter dopamine have been associated with symptoms of schizophrenia. So you've got serotonin, which looks at depression, and then you have dopamine, which looks at schizophrenia. Now, schizophrenia is a form of psychosis where you would lose touch with reality. So you aren't aware of what's real and what isn't, and it can present itself in lots of different ways. But one of the main ways is through hallucinations and delusions. Now, hallucinations are perceptions that are unreal, and a delusion is a belief that is unreal. So believing that somebody is after you, or believing that you have information and the government want to speak to you about something. Whereas a hallucination is more of a perception. So that could be anything within any of your senses. So you could see things, hear things, smell things, feel like things are touching you. And it's caused by having too much dopamine in your brain. Okay, so your brain is producing too much dopamine. Again, it can be natural. Again, it can be caused by something that is outside of your control. It could also be a genetic thing. Now, drugs used for treating schizophrenia block dopamine activity. So we don't want it. We've got too much of it. So we need to try and kill it off. We need to block it. We don't want it passing through that presynaptic neuron into the postsynaptic neuron to try and help alleviate some of these symptoms. So again, if I go back to my drawing, we want to block it. We don't want it there. Okay, there's too much of it and we don't want it to attach itself to these receptor sites. So we may use an SSRI, which you may have done within the biological approach. I think I've done another video on that, which will block dopamine. Or we could have a look at different types of drugs. There's lots of drugs that are neuroleptic drugs, and a neuroleptic drug is a drug that kills off the dopamine as well. So we can literally get rid of it in the brain also. So there are two examples of neurotransmitters that you may want to use when you're explaining this assumption. So again, if we're going back to that really, really mini way to plan an answer, what is the assumption? Well, the assumption here is that you have neurotransmitters in your brain, They are chemical messengers, and they are moving around your brain to help you process how to think and feel and behave. What does it mean? It means that we have a 4-stage process called synaptic transmission, and you can talk through the 4-stage process, this one that I talked about before. So this is where you would really, like I said, bring in that terminology. Let me get my next slide on. List your details, okay? Give us the detail. Say that there is, you know, neurotransmitters that are packed into vesicles. The vesicles, you know, help it diffuse across the synaptic gap. It's all of those words that really show the examiner that you know what you're talking about here. And then, like always, the really important bit is making sure you have got an example. Now, you can use serotonin or dopamine, but you would have to make sure that you use a lot of detail to make sure, you know, if you just use one, that you're adding detail in. Okay, so dopamine associated with schizophrenia. Schizophrenia is when you lose touch with reality. It means that you have too much dopamine in your brain. Therefore, you would administer a drug to try and reduce the amount of dopamine traveling across the synaptic gap and binding to the receptor sites on the postsynaptic neuron. That's the level of detail that we need in order for the examiner to feel really confident that you are confident in what you're talking about. Let's have a little look at, again, now I know this says localization of brain function, but if it was to say neurotransmitters, we need to make sure that we have, you know, a level of accuracy is thorough. Okay, it's making sure that you've squeezed everything out of your brain and you've put it on that page. Have you really made sure that somebody understands that you know about this assumption? An effective use of terminology. The link to psychology, that's where your example comes in. Okay, wherever it says linked to psychology, that's the serotonin, that's the dopamine, that's Broca's aphasia, that's Wernicke's aphasia, that is altruistic behaviour, and that's EEA. That's where it links to psychology. Now, 3 marks, description and is accurate and reasonable. So thorough and reasonable are the differences there, and linked to psychology, and there's a good use. Now, 2 marks, so half of the marks, is linked to psychology may not be clear. So that means that your example that you're using isn't good enough for your answer. Now, 1 mark is no link to psychology, so no example. So if you forget the example, you are, you know, you're only getting 1 mark, and that's why the examples are really important in your answer, and something that I would definitely encourage you to make sure that you're revising. Okay, let's go back to where we were. All right, so summing up what I was saying then, we're going to use this 3-point plan. Really, really easy, really, really simple. What is the assumption? What does it mean? List your details, provide details where possible, link to psychology, make sure you have an example. If you use that structure, it will really, really help you in these questions. Now, just to recap what I said at the beginning, you know, you're going to look at 3 assumptions. You need to make sure you revise them all, because you could be asked about a specific one. They are usually range between 4 and 8 marks, which is a lot. You know, sometimes that can be the decider between a grade. You can be asked to describe specific assumptions, or you will be asked to pick 1 or 2 from an approach. Having examples is very important, and using appropriate terminology also. And then for revision tips, I think in order to look at the terminology, a glossary of key terms is really, really important. So making sure that you know what altruism means, what EEA is and what it stands for, the synaptic cleft, vesicles, all these different key terms that I talk about, writing them all down and making sure you can define what those words are is a really nice place to start. And then creating mind maps of information you do know, so do it without your notes, and then go back, check your notes and add in any missing information in another colour. That way you know what you know, but you also can identify what you don't know, and that's also really important in progressing with revision. So that is the end of this session. The next session is going to look at evaluation questions, again with some exam technique. I really hope that has been helpful. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you in the next video. Diolch.